Good afternoon. My name is Joe Lenti, and I am an applicant to Humanities Washington 2025 Speakers Bureau. Today, I would like to give a short sample of a talk that I would present here to residents of our great state called An Informal State, Global Housing Lessons for Local Housing Problems. The first thing I would need to do is establish who I am, give a little personal context to explain why I'm interested in the subject and why I have some particular insight into it. I am a history professor at EWU. I've been at Eastern since 2010, so I've been in the region now for 15 years. And I've always been a historian of the urban world, specifically of Latin America, ancient and modern. So I've taught a lot of classes on Latin American history, world history, urban history in particular. I'm currently working on completing a book on urban history in the tiny but very, very important Republic of Costa Rica. This is a book that looks at things like land dispossession, eviction, land invasion or squatting, and ultimately informal settlements in that particular place, with a kind of with a gaze that goes pan-regional across all of the region of Latin America. So in the course of developing this book, I spoke to a lot of folks who were always wondering how these questions of land invasion, squatting, informal housing, how they compare to what we see in our own society, what we see in the city of Spokane, where there is an informal housing crisis right now that seems to be growing by the year. Initially, I didn't think there was much overlap at all. When I think of houselessness in the United States, I think mostly about things like tents, encampments, tent cities, increasingly squatting in vacant buildings. That doesn't look anything hardly like what you'd see in Latin America when you have large, established shanty towns. Call them asentamientos humanos in Mexico. Call them precarios in Costa Rica. Call them favelas in Brazil. So there doesn't seem to be a lot of overlap. But the deeper you dig into this subject, you realize there is, in fact, quite a bit, largely in the causes that leads people into the states of informal housing. So I believe there is a kind of important discussion to be had here, a transnational discussion which can provide quite a bit of insight and hopefully help us think about possible solutions in a global lessons from outside of our country, international lessons to apply to local problems. As importantly as any of these other roles I mentioned, I'm a concerned neighbor and dad. I am married, have 4 kids. We live in a section of town where houselessness is omnipresent. We see it every day. We saw it yesterday in a hike through our kind of local park. We see tents kind of nestled under trees. You see folks on sidewalks in tents. I lived next door to a squatted house, one of these quote zombie homes that was vacant but occupied for years. That was part of our experience there. I am the chair of my neighborhood council, Latah Hangman neighborhood, which is a very, very cool kind of nook of the city. Has a lot of green space, a lot of kind of public parks, which means there is quite a bit of camping. And as the chair of the neighborhood council, the neighbors are concerned. That is probably the number one item on the agenda every month when we meet, is basically mitigation of encampments and the potential risks that encampments pose, for example, wildfire, which is becoming, as we approach summer, that becomes a much more prominent issue to deal with. So the talk would establish these kind of basic subject and goals. Everywhere we look today, we see people living in informal conditions. We see a boarded up but occupied house in our neighborhood, or a cluster of tents under a tree in our park. Yet mention housing informality to a Washingtonian, and they envision Hoovervilles of a bygone era, or shantytowns in a foreign land. As informality spikes in our communities, so too do our fears about a decline in public health and safety, with the result very often being informal habitation bans that are indicative of our growing fear of the unhoused in society. This talk places the crisis of housing informality in Washington state inside a transnational conversation, It assesses informal housing in several global settings and the countermeasures that have been implemented in those places, successfully or otherwise. This analysis asks us to consider what wisdom we may glean from other people's experiences and what strategies we may effectively apply in the communities we live in today. So the talk could be anywhere between a half an hour, 45 minutes, an hour, more, if folks requested that. I think a 45-minute talk with plenty of time for Q&A would be ideal. But the talk is also going to be interspersed with these kind of brainstorm breaks. When I ask folks questions and I ask them to pair and share, to get together with their neighbors to answer basic questions, even write their answers on index cards, which I can distribute around the room. Basic questions like, what is housing informality? What causes it? These are questions that are unique to locations. Certainly housing informality in the United States, in Washington, as I mentioned, looks a little different than it might in a place like Costa Rica, Mexico, Brazil. The basic causes of it, however, are pretty similar, and we would delve deeply into those questions. Folks might think that housing informality looks like this. Their mind might go back a century to a Hooverville near Eddy Shipyards in Seattle from the 1930s. Interestingly, there are communities in Latin America today that look a lot like this. It's not the 1930s there, it's the 2020s, but you do see shanties on the fringes of big industrial areas. These are places that I've researched deeply, I've spent time, I've studied, I've worked with their inhabitants, their residents, their activists. And I think there's lessons to be learned from those places that can be applied here in terms of overcoming informality and putting people on a path toward permanent housing. What we think about in the city of Spokane, in Seattle, all over our state, all over our region, when we think about housing informality, we think about things like homeless camps, camping, zombie homes, homeless shelters, tent cities. This is a national problem, but it seems particularly striking here in the Northwest, in the West. We think about huge cities like Los Angeles. The issue that they have with camping is a very, very kind of salient issue right now in the 21st century. So these are all issues that people are going to have kind of personal, very, very kind of firsthand experience with. And the goal is to kind of talk about root causes, talk about the experience of what it's like to live in such conditions, and also think about potential solutions, to brainstorm and kind of pool our resources as students, activists, academics, politicians, neighborhood council members, just generally concerned and considerate members of a community. So all of these kind of various forms of informality. Coming from Spokane, I'm very familiar with the case of Camp Hope. I could show clips that kind of show this place that in 2022 became home to over 600 individuals, making it the largest tent city in the state. And Camp Hope divided Spokane deeply. It created this kind of rift between folks who were sympathetic toward the cause toward the plight of the folks inhabiting in this place and those who weren't. It pitted the city government with the state government, as this was a tent city that emerged on state land that resided on the fringe of city land. So there was a jurisdictional battle here that kind of divided the town, and it was influential in, say, that the elections that ensued. So it's a very, very important case study in informal housing, a kind of jurisdictional, kind of legislative conflict, which I think you could find parallels around the state. You certainly can when you look beyond the state and into places like Latin America, where some of the case studies I've gone into in Costa Rica are identical to this, although the dwellings look different. Something that we can all relate to as well. What causes informality? Why is this a situation, this is a problem that's growing seemingly by the day? Why are folks moving into Spokane, for example? Why is the cost of living rising so precipitously? How is that impacting, say, the housing situation? So there's a lot of kind of universal issues here that people can get into, all the while considering what, you know, how this kind of rise in informality might be dangerous to society, and why it needs to be a tide that's curbed immediately. Let me just kind of focus again, because a lot of this will be about my research abroad in Costa Rica and Mexico. And communities like you see here, in fact, I took this picture on the bottom left, are the product of economic crisis, inflation, cost of living increases, in-migration from inside the country as well as outside the country. And these are communities that are seemingly different, as I mentioned, to say, tent cities or homeless encampments in the US. But the experience of informality, I contend, is the same. It's largely universal. Costa Rica struggles because young men, for example, these two guys you see here in the photo, who've spent their entire lives in a precario, they feel disconnected from the mainstream. They are much more likely to kind of adopt extremist political positions in order to kind of, escape informality, escape marginalization, escape poverty. My partners in Costa Rica point to kind of changes political extremism in a place like Costa Rica in a way that responds to this kind of growing precariat in a way that I think, again, has parallels in our own state. So there's a lot of kind of overlap here, which we could delve into. Why study informality around the world? That's the essence of this talk. Again, my expertise is in Latin America. A precario in Costa Rica, a shantytown, looks like this. It's basically a latter-day version of something you would have seen here in the state of Washington some 100 years ago. The ultimate goal here is to take us to change, to reform, to kind of some kind of global transnational policy. So the second and kind of what I consider the kind of pivotal brainstorm break we would take is to break down what we've seen in other societies, and then think about what has been being done in our own homes. What steps have been taken, are being taken to curb these problems in our communities? Have they been successful? And what can we learn from the examples of others? Ultimately, the goal here is to kind of gain a transnational context, a transnational perspective in a way that will lead us toward kind of affecting positive change. There should be some general takeaways from this. And as I kind of, finish or fine tune this presentation, I'm moving toward these conclusions I've come to in the Latin American context, and they seem applicable. They are applicable, I believe, in the Washington context. Should we do this? Implement camping bans that constantly criminalize the houseless? Should we invest in these kind of congregate housing shelters, which are underutilized and simply ineffective at kind of reducing homeless populations? Or is the answer, in fact, regularization, urbanization, the creation of working class housing? I'll leave you with an example here of this concept of regularization, urbanization, which comes from Mexico City. This is a Google map that you would have seen. I believe it's from 2020, 2023, perhaps. This is a place I worked in 10 years prior to that, in 2013. Everything on the left of this image, those are shacks, those are shanties. You can tell by the sheet metal roofs. To the right, you see urbanization. Areas that used to be shacks, but that were eradicated with low-cost, kind of low-income working class housing built in place. From shacks to housing. And this urbanization is kind of the primary source of urbanization in most of the developing world. I contend that in the United States, we need a similar solution. We need working class housing in place of informal housing in a way to move people off the streets and into a more permanent, less marginalized existence. So there's quite a bit we can learn from these experiences, from these case studies abroad. And I hope to have these discussions with our friends in our state. So I thank you all again for considering my application, and I look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.